I don't necessarily have a story about this next thing, but I figured I would just mention it. Did you all get a chance to see this show yet? It's on Amazon Prime. Um, Shiny Happy People. They did season one a year ago, I believe, maybe 2 years ago, but it was about the Duggar family and the conservative Christian religion that their family belongs to and how disturbing it is. But season two just came out, I believe, a week ago, and it's 3 episodes. They're not terribly long. It was fantastic. There are no spoilers here. I mean, I'm going to talk about it, but I don't think you're getting any spoilers here. It was a really interesting take. And specifically, what this season of Shiny Happy People focused on was something called Teen Mania. And if you're not familiar with it, you can go on Wikipedia right now and check it out. But Teen Mania Ministries. And in the late 90s, mid to late 90s, this was a huge thing. It was like the youth ministry for all of America. And it was founded by a guy named Ron Luce. The goal was to get kids to turn to Jesus and reject sex, drugs, alcohol. And like at its peak, this is an interesting article. This is from Christianity Today. Back in at the time, 73,000 teens pledged responsibility. What's the date on this? It's from June 14th, 1999. But look at the first paragraph. The same week that two teenagers murdered a dozen of their classmates in Littleton, Colorado, Columbine, 73,000 youth gathered in Pontiac, Michigan to declare they would live with honor, take responsibility for their actions, and respect authority. So the Columbine thing we'll get to in a bit, but at its peak, this ministry is drawing in tens of thousands of kids. I think that particular event represented over 3,000 church youth groups from across the country. They made a whole thing of it. They went to Michigan for this event. And what is it? It's like just a giant MAGA rally, except at the time it was all about Jesus, right? So it was a big deal. They called those events Acquire the Fire. Get the fire in your belly for Jesus. And look, if part of the goal here is we want kids to abstain from doing bad things that we consider sin, maybe that's okay. But the docuseries made really clear how problematic these events and the ministry were. For example, guess what they had in this ministry? Rampant abuse. Surprise! Like, that's according to former members. There was also a culture of fear that criticizing Teen Mania or Ron Luce meant turning your back on God. Like, you don't criticize the guy who basically is a prophet and has a direct line to Jesus. There's very much an us versus them mentality you get from these rallies that, Christians are inherently good and everyone who's not one of us is a bad, bad person who needs to be saved. Uh, Here's the thing that I did not know. They brought on interns. They called them interns, but one of the things a lot of these talking heads in the docuseries talked about is they would go to these rallies and they would look around. Who's running the cameras and the lights and the sound? It's all other kids, other teenagers. And isn't that a cool thing? Like, I want to be one of those kids who's running this show. And a lot of these people were like, Mom, Dad, I want to go work for this ministry, like right now over the summer. And they were called interns. And really, those interns ended up doing menial labor for Ron Luce. And guess what? They had to pay for the privilege to do it. They were paying like a tuition to go run the cameras for this guy. It was wild. Then there were like hardcore military style boot camps for members of the Teen Mania Honor Academy, rather. And really, this was a way to see, do you really have what it takes to be a part of this? And they ran it like you are a new cadet in the army, where there's sleep deprivation. I think one person talked about rolling in vomit because they were so sick, but they also didn't want to give up because that would be like saying, I don't really have faith. I don't know how any of that brings kids closer to God, but there you go. I think one commentator said this in the series: how do you know you're in a cult if that's your normal. Because if you're surrounded by this, this is what you're supposed to do. And I think that statement cuts deeper when you go through all these 3 episodes. Do you remember there was that Christian missionary several years ago, John Allen Chow? He was the idiot who decided to go to India, get on a boat, go to an island where there were uncontacted indigenous tribes that lived on an island. And he was like, I will contact them. And you know what they need? The Bible. And then he found a way. He bribed some boat people and made them get close to the island where they're not allowed to go. And then the uncontacted tribe came out to see him, and then they shot him and killed him with bows and arrows. And he totally deserved it, because what the hell is he doing? He could have destroyed all of them with viruses. But anyway, you remember when you heard that story and you're like, that guy was clearly brainwashed to do something that irresponsible and that stupid. And when you watch this docuseries, if you weren't part of this growing up, and I was not a Christian growing up or anything, so this is not normal to me. But when you listen to the docuseries and you hear from people who grew up in this environment, it's like you can totally tell how easy it is to get that mindset that anything is okay as long as you're doing it to advance the kingdom, right? And you also find out, like, all these kids are being told, if not in the exact words, it's implied that lying or physically harming themselves for Jesus is a worthy way to walk through life. They interviewed the author Jeff Charlotte, who's written a lot about Christian nationalism. And one of the things he said is that kids are taught in this ministry that they are expendable, and that, and I'm quoting here, the most valuable thing you could ever do is die for your faith. And this brings us back to that Columbine mention from earlier, because Teen Mania was at the height of its popularity around the time Columbine happened. I will tell you, for me, that was like my sophomore year of high school. So, like, I was of the age when that's all we were talking about. And one of the stories that went viral after that shooting occurred is that someone, like, the story began getting passed around that there was a girl at Columbine, and the shooters said something like, "Do you believe in God?" And she said, "Yes." And then they killed her. And it turns out that story is a lie. But when the Teen Mania people, they were like, hey, that story's true, and that's what you should all aspire to do. Are you willing to die for your faith like that girl did, even though she didn't? So this is very much drilled into their heads that not only do I have to believe in God, I have to be willing to die for my God. And if I told you this was a series, if this was going on, but it was about Islam and not Christianity, or it was about Satanism and not Christianity, I think by and large there would be a massive outcry. People would call it brainwashing. But because it's Christianity, it's treated as totally normal. One of the people they interviewed in the docu-series is April Ajoy, who is fantastic. She's a Christian, but she's very much critical of this type of Christianity. She grew up in this world, and if I could pull this up here for a second, one of the things she said is that when she was growing up and listening to people like Ron Luce, it was, the thinking was always very black and white. You know, there was no nuance to what he ever said. Here we go. Let me show you this really quick. She said, "You leave so fired up and you have this deep sense of purpose that there's no higher calling than for you to give up your entire life to spread the gospel, to save souls. Because you literally believe that if people do not have your beliefs, that they do not believe in Jesus the way you do, that they will die and go to hell." So that's from, that's not April. April's in here somewhere. But anyway, that's just, they had really good people talking throughout the series. I would also point out these beliefs are not unique to Ron Luce, to Teen Mania. This is a message that you hear in so many evangelical megachurches today. But when your brain is not fully formed, to be told that your only purpose in life is to play a part in this fictional, eternal war is so disturbing. And many of those victims are just now coming to terms with how fucked up their childhoods were because of men like Ron Luce. Obviously, all of this became political in the 2000s. Ron Luce impressed upon those children that if they were true Christians, they would not just believe in Jesus, they would take part in the culture wars. So they got to reject marriage equality, they got to oppose reproductive rights, no abortion, as if those things are required by the Christian God in order to achieve salvation. I asked April, who was in this docuseries, now that the series is out, now that she's had a chance to watch it, what did she think about it all? Like, was it accurate? How was it portrayed? She told me she really appreciated that aspect of it, how Teen Mania was tied into today's Christian nationalism, so that she said, so that people can see more clearly how radicalized teens turn into radicalized adults. And one of the points she wanted to stress is that even if some people like her managed to escape the grasp of that ministry, a lot of people they know did not, have not. These are the people that show up on January 6th. One thing I also had not thought, I was like thinking to myself as I'm watching this series, I haven't heard much about Teen Mania in recent years, and that's because it basically came to an end about a decade ago. This is from a 2015 article from Religion News Service that highlighted how Teen Mania was shutting down. And look at this paragraph right here. Although Ron Luce would want us to believe that Teen Mania is closing because they accomplished the mission they set out for, the numbers tell a very different story. After years of declining revenue and waning influence, there was little demand for the product Teen Mania was putting out. Evangelical Christianity in America is changing, and young people are growing up in a different, more pluralistic society than those who were raised in the 80s and 90s. Oh, to go back in time and say something to the person who wrote this story. Like, oh, you wish we were getting more pluralistic. I hate to tell you. Anyway, the closing of Teen Mania is part of a shift in evangelical engagement in public life. Younger Christians no longer want to fight the culture wars that their parents did with the moral majority. They're more likely to be accepting of homosexuality than their parents were. And they recognize that America's religious pluralism requires sensitivity, not emotionally manipulative evangelistic tactics. That's adorable because a bunch of those people then voted for Donald Trump and are still very much MAGA cultists today. They just replaced their religion with a political religion, and they're still awful, awful human beings. Ugh. By the way, there were also legal problems with Teen Mania. Luce didn't show up for court dates. Teen Mania didn't pay some of its partners. It's a whole thing. One other thing, when I watched the series, something that stood out to me, it seems like all the biggest fears that Ron Luce had back in the day, he's always preaching sermons against like MTV and alcohol and premarital sex. Like, it all seems so damn quaint in light of what those same evangelical Christians have become today. Because, like, what's a bigger concern today? Kids who start vaping or conservative Christians who defend a race baiting, bribe loving, wildly ignorant sex predator? I don't know. I'll take the vaping any day. That it's really not that big of a deal, relatively speaking. And if you think the vaping is a sin, but that the latter, who cares? That's acceptable for the greater good. Maybe your religion is the problem here. So the series points out Teen Mania went from telling kids to reject mainstream media, mainstream culture, to telling them they need to take over that culture. And even though the ministry is no longer around, I would argue that in many ways they have actually succeeded at that, because right now they have more power than ever before. The people who would have run Teen Mania today are now the ones running the government. And they are doing all the worst things, but it affects all of us, not just the people in that conservative Christian bubble. I guess if there's any silver lining, it's that one thing this docuseries shows is that Teen Mania was partly defeated because a lot of the people saw the light and they realized how much abuse was happening, emotional abuse, physical abuse, and they spoke out against it. And if those people were able to see the light and come out and tell their stories and get that whole ministry to disappear over the course of several years, maybe there's hope that some of these MAGA cultists will snap out of it at some point. I mean, I'm not saying this is going to happen. I don't have a ton of hope, that they're finally going to see the light after 10 years of Trumpism. But like, if those kids can do it as adults now, maybe there's hope we could break this spell and defeat the legacy that this ministry left in its wake. All right, I'm going to pause there for now. Any questions here? The martyrdom complex is still huge. There are literal reels out there of people acting out being persecuted, unalived for their faith. I've seen some of that on TikTok. I've seen some people making fun of some of that on TikTok and Fundy Snark and all those subreddits and things like that. So it's very much alive. And it's, even if it's not Teen Mania, it's, like I said, it's happening in evangelical churches, whether they're doing hell houses during Halloween or Easter programs. And yeah, I mean, the manipulation is still very much there. I really hate our government. How many years later and they have not done crap about gun control? Yeah, not specifically about the story, but I agree. One thing I saw this week that made me happy a little bit is that after Zoran Mamdani won the New York city mayoral primary, I think 8,000 people went to the group Run for Something and signed up. They want to be elected officials, and they were like, I want to know what I can do to get elected to local office, not mayor, just like, let me get involved with city council, school board, something like that. More people signed up to say they wanted to get involved politically after they saw Mamdani and like smart, intelligent progressives do something big. And not just because current Democratic leaders, Chuck Schumer, Hakeem Jeffries, did nothing of value. Like, they're not doing it because they just want to see the depressing, useless, older politicians get out of the way. They're doing it because they see younger ones doing something exciting. And they were like, I want to be on that train. So maybe as more people start getting involved locally and start getting elected to office, getting campaigns under their belt so they can eventually run for higher office, that's the way you start to see some of this stuff change. It was also kind of nice to see some of those right-wing nutcases like say, hey, maybe this Epstein thing is kind of a big deal and maybe Trump is handling it a wrong way, and like watching them back away from Trump a little bit. I don't think it'll last, but for a moment, it was nice to see.